Before the first pyramids, before pharaohs and written kings, there was a place whose stones still hum with questions. Tucked on a windswept plateau in southeastern Anatolia, Göbekli Tepe rises from the earth not as a settlement, but as a carved, deliberate miracle. Concentric rings of T-shaped pillars, each one taller than a grown man, each one etched with animals and symbols that refuse easy translation. Radiocarbon dates place the earliest phases of those monumental circles near the end of the 10th millennium BCE, roughly 11,000 years ago, long before the Nile cities we think of as the cradle of civilization. The site was first recognized in mid-20th century surveys, but it wasn't until German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavations in the mid-1990s that the world grasped its scale. Schmidt uncovered pillars weighing tons, sculpted with bulls, foxes, vultures, and abstract motifs, evidence that complex ritual architecture existed among communities we once called simple hunter-gatherers. That overturns a tidy narrative. Monumental religious life did not wait patiently for agriculture to arrive. For decades, the story held that Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried around the early 8th millennium BCE, entombed as if its builders wanted their own work to be secreted from later eyes. Recent research has complicated that picture, showing signs of longer occupation, domestic activity, and environmental forces that may have shaped its fate. But the core astonishment remains. People without pottery or fully developed farming organized labor and imagination on an epic scale. So ask yourself as the camera drifts over carved stone and drifting dust, if not Egypt, then where and how did the idea of civilization begin? In this series, we'll follow the evidence, not the myths, and listen closely to what the oldest stones can tell us about who we were when the world first learned to build meaning out of rock. If you want more slow, careful dives like this one, quietly tap subscribe and leave a single line in the comments. Tell me more.
Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a map of human history with one of its boldest lines pushed back by thousands of years. The neat timeline you learned in school, hunter-gatherers, then farming, then cities and kings, begins to blur when you stand on the slope of Göbekli Tepe. The stones here force a rethink. Monumental architecture, complex symbolic life, and organized labor appear far earlier than the classical birthplaces of civilization. This part lays out the dates, cultural labels, and the archaeological evidence so you can follow the sequence with clarity. Göbekli Tepe sits on a limestone ridge about 15 kilometers northeast of modern Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey. Radiocarbon dating of material recovered from the site places the main phases of construction in the late 10th millennium to the early 8th millennium BCE, roughly between c. 9600 BCE and c. 8200 BCE, with some activity possibly continuing slightly later. These dates put the site within the pre-pottery Neolithic A, PPNA, and into the early pre-pottery Neolithic B, PPNB, phases of the Near Eastern Neolithic sequence. In short, these monumental enclosures are about 11 to 12,000 years old, and therefore substantially older than the earliest Egyptian monumental architecture by several millennia. Archaeologists divide Göbekli Tepe into major occupation layers that reflect changing use over time. The most impressive structures, the large circular and oval enclosures with heavy T-shaped pillars, belong to what is called Layer 3, typically dated to the earlier part of the site sequence, the late 10th millennium BCE. Above these lie Layer 2 remains that include smaller stone buildings and evidence of different activities. Later still are traces that suggest people returned to the mound sporadically after the monumental buildings were abandoned. Although the radiocarbon series is still being refined, the overall picture is clear. Early, large-scale ritual architecture, then later smaller-scale activity, then eventual abandonment and reuse.
One of the most consequential facts about Göbekli Tepe is that it was constructed before ceramics and before the widespread evidence for fully developed farming in the region. For decades, scholars described its builders as hunter-gatherers who nonetheless organized labor and resources to raise and carve multi-ton pillars, an observation that upended the older linear model that assumed large monuments required settled agricultural surplus. Excavations and associated analyses show stone tool types and other material culture consistent with late Epipaleolithic (PPNA) lifeways rather than an agricultural village economy. That said, recent work has complicated this neat divide by revealing signs of food processing and other domestic activities in parts of the site, suggesting the boundary between foragers and early farmers was porous and locally variable. The secure conclusion is this: the builders were not city-based agrarian states like those that would later produce Egyptian pyramids, yet they achieved organizational complexity on an extraordinary scale. Radiocarbon dating remains the backbone of the chronological argument. Multiple samples, charcoal, burned bone, and other datable residues have been processed from sealed contexts associated with building phases. While early radiocarbon results required careful interpretation, some early samples came from later fills. Successive campaigns and improved stratigraphic controls have strengthened the case for a mid-late 10th millennium BCE for the oldest enclosures. German and Turkish teams continued to refine the sequence, but the consensus among specialist publications and site authorities is that the monumental work at Göbekli Tepe predates the beginnings of city life and pharaonic Egypt by many centuries, if not millennia. The period that produced Göbekli Tepe follows the end of the last ice age and falls within episodes of notable climatic instability, including the climatic anomalies around the Younger Dryas, c. 12,900 to 11,700 BP, and later the 8.2 kiloyear event around 6,200 BCE, though the main Göbekli phases precede the latter. Changes in wild plant and animal distributions and in human mobility patterns likely shaped social strategies across the Near East. Some scholars argue these shifting environmental conditions helped spur new kinds of communal projects, shared ritual centers, cooperative hunts, and large-scale construction as groups negotiated risks and resources. The point is not to reduce Göbekli Tepe to climate alone, but to situate it in a world where human communities were experimenting with new forms of cooperation. To make the scale of time clear, compare dates. The main monuments of Göbekli Tepe are around 9,600 to 8,200 BCE. By contrast, the earliest large stone constructions in Egypt, for example the early mastaba tombs and the step pyramid tradition, appear many millennia later, from roughly c. 3000 to 2600 BCE, the early dynastic and Old Kingdom periods. Mesopotamian urbanism and writing similarly develop after 3500 BCE. The implication is not that Göbekli Tepe is a civilization identical to Egypt or Sumer. Rather, it shows that sophisticated symbolic architecture and organized communal labor existed long before the rise of states and writing in the 4th millennium BCE. A careful reading of the dates forces us to reframe cause and effect in early social evolution. If monumental ritual centers like Göbekli Tepe existed earlier than agriculture-based cities, then the older model that farming produced surplus, surplus produced specialists, and specialists produced monuments is incomplete. Instead, scholars now explore scenarios in which ritual, shared belief, and periodic aggregation may have helped drive cooperation and resource management that then facilitated the domestication process. In other words, religion and communal projects might have been drivers of social complexity as much as outcomes. This remains a debated frontier, but the chronological facts make the debate possible. Finally, remember that archaeology refines itself rather than overturns itself overnight. Göbekli Tepe's basic chronology, monumental enclosures dating to the late 10th to early 8th millennium BCE, is well supported and widely accepted by specialists and UNESCO alike. At the same time, new samples, improved radiocarbon calibration, and wider regional surveys continued to nuance the picture. There are hints of settlement-scale activity, connections to nearby contemporary sites like Karahan Tepe, and varied patterns of use over centuries. The broad stroke is stable. These are among the earliest large-scale human constructions we know. The details will sharpen with each field season.
The story of Göbekli Tepe's rediscovery reads like a slow-motion scientific thriller. A place people had walked past for generations. A farmer's field that hid enormous carved stones, and then, in the hands of one archaeologist, a fragment of prehistory that would force specialists to rethink the sequence of human social development. Early visitors and surveys treated the hill as unremarkable. In 1963, a regional survey identified the mound. The name Göbekli Tepe means potbelly hill in Turkish, and surface finds were catalogued. At the time, observers mistook the visible stone slabs for ordinary tombstones or rock cleared from fields. Those initial notes would sit in archives for 3 decades, while the stones continued to weather in silence. Everything changed in October 1994. Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist who had worked at other Neolithic sites in the region, started asking local people about hills with flint or unusual stones. He was guided to the Göbekli Tepe ridge by a landowner, Mahmut Yildiz, whose family had already turned up finds while plowing the field. What Schmidt saw, the vertical tops of enormous T-shaped pillars protruding from the hill, did not fit the prevailing map of prehistoric social complexity. He began formal excavations the next year, and over the following 2 decades uncovered a sequence of monumental stone enclosures that radiocarbon dates place in the late 10th to early 8th millennium BCE. These dates and Schmidt's excavations are the pivot of the site's shock to archaeology. The physical evidence Schmidt and his team uncovered is striking and unambiguous. Within the mound are circular and oval enclosures bounded by low stone walls with massive T-shaped limestone pillars set in their centers. Many pillars reach heights greater than a person and were carved in high relief with animals, boars, foxes, birds, snakes, and abstract motifs. The scale of the stones, the technical skill involved in shaping and raising them, and the density of decorated pillars made it clear this was not a scatter of grave markers. It was intentional, monumental architecture. That realization is what sent reverberations through the field. A complex, symbolic, communal project at a time when, according to Orthodox narratives, people were still largely mobile hunter-gatherers. The chronological evidence is central to the shock. Multiple radiocarbon samples from contexts associated with the earliest enclosures place their construction around the end of the 10th millennium BCE, roughly c. 9600 to 9000 BCE for the earliest phases, with activity continuing into the 9th and early 8th millennium BCE. That timing makes the enclosures thousands of years older than the earliest cities and monumental architecture of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and it forced scholars to ask whether sophisticated communal organization might predate or even help produce the agricultural and urban revolutions that followed. Radiocarbon dating, careful stratigraphic recording, and the repeated campaigns of excavation are why dates for Göbekli Tepe are considered robust by specialists, even if refinements continue. Schmidt's interpretations were bold and at first controversial. He proposed that Göbekli Tepe was primarily a ritual center, a sanctuary where groups gathered seasonally to perform shared ceremonies. Under that model, hunting and gathering groups could have organized labor for building and carving the stones without being fully settled farmers. That argument directly challenged the older linear model that held agriculture produced surplus, surplus produced specialists,
and specialists produced monuments. Instead, Göbekli Tepe suggested an alternative sequence. Large-scale ritual and cooperation might have been among the social forces that encouraged more permanent settlements and cultivation. That reframing energized debate and generated both enthusiasm and skepticism. Scholarly pushback and refinement followed, as is normal in science. Some archaeologists pointed out that parts of the mound showed domestic debris and evidence of food processing, hinting that the site may not have been exclusively a seasonal sanctuary. Others argued the complexity of the monuments still required some form of sustained organization and resource pooling. In short, Göbekli Tepe did not settle the chicken or egg argument between ritual and agriculture. It complicated it. That complexity is actually the point. New data have forced scholars to redraw boundaries between forager and farmer, showing those categories were likely much more fluid at the dawn of the Neolithic than once imagined. The site's preservation and the way it was found also shaped the scientific reaction. Much of the monumental architecture survived because the enclosures were deliberately backfilled. Centuries after they were built, people appear to have buried the monumental rings under layers of soil and debris. That act of deliberate covering preserved art and architecture that otherwise would have eroded away. The reasons for the backfilling remain debated. Ritual closure, practical reuse of stone and soil, or responses to social or environmental change have all been proposed. But the burial is what allowed modern archaeologists to read the enclosures as coherent, sealed episodes rather than scattered, ambiguous fragments. As news of Göbekli Tepe spread beyond academic journals, the public imagination ran ahead of the data. Popular articles described it as the world's first temple and compared it to Stonehenge, which is useful for conveying scale but risks simplifying nuance. The scientific community responded with careful but accessible syntheses. Yes, it is among the oldest known large-scale monumental complexes, but no, it is not a civilization in the sense archaeologists use that term for urban, state-level societies with writing and complex economies. Instead, Göbekli Tepe's importance lies in demonstrating that humans were capable of organizing symbolic, communal projects much earlier than conventionally assumed, and that our models of social evolution must account for that fact. The discovery also changed field methods in the region. Once Göbekli Tepe's significance was recognized, archaeologists undertook more intensive surveys and remote sensing work across southeastern Turkey. Similar, if smaller sites and contemporary enclosures emerged in the archaeological record, for example, Karahan Tepe to the northwest, suggesting Göbekli Tepe was part of a wider constellation of late Epipaleolithic and early Neolithic activity in Upper Mesopotamia. That regional perspective reinforced the idea that complex symbolic practices were not a single anomaly, but part of broader social experiments at the end of the Pleistocene. Finally, the human story behind the stones matters. Klaus Schmidt, who directed the excavations from 1995 until his death in 2014, became a public face of the site, a careful, persistent field archaeologist who pushed the interpretation of the evidence while acknowledging uncertainty. His work inspired a generation of archaeologists to look at the deep past with new curiosity, and his team's meticulous excavation methods produced the stratigraphic and chronological controls that make Göbekli Tepe a defensible, not sensational addition to human prehistory. After Schmidt's passing, the German Archaeological Institute and Turkish partners continued the work, building conservation programs and broader research agendas that move beyond single-site spectacle to systematic regional analysis. Discovery can be a jolt, but the shock of Göbekli Tepe is productive. It is a corrective to tidy narratives, an invitation to embrace complexity, and a reminder that material remains can rewrite long-held assumptions. The stones themselves do not hand us a manifesto, they hand us questions. Who gathered to lift those pillars? How were they organized? What did those animal carvings mean to people who left no writing? Archaeology's job is to listen to those silent voices carefully, weigh the evidence, and allow interpretations to shift as new data arrive. The shock of discovery is only the beginning. The disciplined work that follows is how knowledge grows.
They left no name on the stones, no tablets, no inscriptions, no royal seal to tell us who ordered the pillars and why. What survives instead is the work itself. Rings of carved limestone, monumental T-shaped pillars, and a scatter of tools and animal bones that let archaeologists pull a silhouette of the people who built Göbekli Tepe. Reconstructing that silhouette means reading absence as carefully as presence, asking what the material remains can reliably tell us and where sensible inference must stop. First, the basics we can state with high confidence. Göbekli Tepe is in southeastern Anatolia, near modern Şanlıurfa, and the principal phases of its monumental construction date to the late 10th through the early 8th millennium BCE, roughly ca. 9600 to 8200 BCE. The site was systematically excavated beginning in the mid-1990s by Klaus Schmidt, whose work revealed deliberately shaped T-pillars, many carved in high relief with animals and abstract signs, arranged in circular and oval enclosures. These are not isolated curiosities. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic work place the construction of the largest enclosures well before the rise of farming-based states in Mesopotamia or the pharaonic monuments of Egypt. That chronological fact forces the first of several necessary caveats. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not city dwellers or state administrators. They left no evidence of writing, no urban plan, and no clear long-term agricultural fields attached to the monumental phase. For much of the first 2 decades after Schmidt's reports, archaeologists described the site as the product of late Epipaleolithic and pre-Pottery Neolithic A communities, groups that, while regionally sedentary in places, still depended substantially on hunting, foraging, and seasonal rounds, rather than intensive cereal agriculture. In other words, the people who raised and decorated those pillars achieved organizational feats normally associated with later agriculturally supported societies, yet they did so in a social world that lacked many of the institutional crutches, writing, taxation, full-time labor specialization, archaeologists often treat as prerequisites for monumentality. But hunter-gatherer should not be read simplistically. Recent and careful study of the site's material culture complicates the neat dichotomy between foragers and farmers. Excavations have recovered an unusually large assemblage of grinding stones, mortars, handstones, and other implements associated with plant processing, equipment that implies intensive handling of cereals and other plant foods at or near the site. Stable isotope and archaeobotanical studies show processing of wild cereals was present and abundant in some contexts. In short, parts of Göbekli Tepe look markedly domestic, even while the monumental enclosures read as ritual architecture. The safest formulation is this: the communities that built and used Göbekli Tepe occupied a social and economic middle ground, increasingly complex in subsistence and organization, but not yet farmers in the full, settled agrarian sense found millennia later. How did groups without known states organize the labor and technical know-how to cut, carve, and raise stone pillars that could weigh many tons? The archaeological evidence offers practical clues. The limestone bedrock that forms the pillars was locally available. The site is sited on a ridge where workable blocks could be quarried nearby, reducing the logistical burden of long-distance transport. Flint tools and pounding implements found in association with the pillars indicate stoneworking was accomplished with chipped stone and simple leverage techniques rather than metal tools. Careful study of tool marks and shaping patterns suggests skilled craft knowledge. Artisans who knew how to dress the stone face,
create high reliefs, and manage the center of gravity so freestanding slabs could be erected and stabilized. Organizing such work requires planning, leadership, and cooperative labor, but it does not, by itself, imply the existence of hereditary rulers or state bureaucracy. The picture is more consistent with episodic, communal projects, seasonal or periodic aggregations of groups pooling labor for shared, probably ritually framed purposes. Socially and symbolically, the builders are visible through the motifs they carved. Animal imagery, foxes, boars, birds, snakes, and large felids, appears repeatedly, sometimes depicted with surprising naturalism, sometimes in violent or dynamic postures. Anthropomorphic pillars, often with stylized arms and belts, hint at a human symbolism that is expressed through monumental form rather than texts. Abstract marks and repeated emblematic designs suggest shared iconographies, perhaps clan symbols, mythic scenes, or calendrical markers. We cannot read them with certainty, but their recurrence demonstrates a coherent symbolic repertoire used by many different enclosures across centuries. The implication is that these people had, collectively, a shared set of meanings and practices extensive enough to sustain large-scale ritual architecture. Economically, the builders relied on mixed strategies. Zooarchaeological analyses from the wider region show a reliance on gazelle, aurochs, and other wild game in the late Epipaleolithic and early Neolithic. At Göbekli Tepe itself, faunal remains include hunted species and signs of communal feasting, large hearth features, concentrations of bone fragments, and cut marks consistent with mass butchery and meat sharing. Feasting is an interpretive model that fits the material pattern. Episodic gatherings for ritual purposes that required provisioning and generated social obligations, a mechanism by which cooperative networks were forged and reforged. That pattern helps explain how groups unanchored to centralized authority could still mobilize labor. Shared ritual goals and reciprocal obligations created the social glue. Demography matters too. Monument construction is costly. It consumes calories, time, and resources that must be diverted from everyday survival tasks. For Göbekli Tepe to emerge, population density and social connectivity in Upper Mesopotamia must have passed a threshold where such investments were feasible. Recent regional surveys and the discovery of nearby sites with T-pillars, for example, Karahan Tepe and other contemporaries, indicate the practice was not a single isolated eccentricity, but part of a wider, regional phenomenon. That wider network allowed labor pools, craft specialists, and shared symbolic languages to circulate across communities, making large projects logistically plausible. Again, these were not cities, but they were connected communities with sufficient scale and trust to undertake monumental work. The absence of writing and the limited durable personal artifacts have a methodological consequence. Much of what we infer about social organization is based on architecture, tools, and externally visible behavior. That creates room for differing interpretations among specialists. Some emphasize the site's ritual and communal functions. Others point to clear signs of domestic activity and argue for a mixed use that included year-round residents. The consensus sits between poles. Göbekli Tepe was a focal point of long-term social experimentation where the boundaries between ritual and domestic life blurred. It is a site in which ceremonial architecture and everyday subsistence practices intersected in ways that helped reshape social life across the region. Finally, the without a name quality of these builders is an archaeological reminder about scale and humility. We can reconstruct diets, toolkits, building sequences, and regional connections, and we can sketch social dynamics like feasting, cooperation, and craft specialization.
We cannot, however, assign personal names, political titles, or literary doctrines to them. That absence is not a failure. It is a crucial constraint that keeps our reconstructions honest. The people of Göbekli Tepe emerge as a coalition of groups who shared ritual worlds and material skills, who could concentrate time and labor into monuments, and who navigated an economic world that was shifting from mobile foraging toward increased plant handling and sedentism. They are architects of an experimental social horizon, builders without a written name, but builders whose traces force us to rewrite the story of how human societies first learned to build meaning at scale.
The pillars and reliefs at Göbekli Tepe do not speak in sentences we can read. They speak in repeated images, emphatic omissions, and carefully chosen absences. That visual language, animal after animal, repeated abstract sign, the subtle human traces on T-shaped pillars, is the single best route we have into the beliefs, social dynamics, and memory practices of people living some 11,000 years ago. Below is a careful, evidence-led tour of that symbolic world. What is carved, what patterns recur, what archaeologists agree on, and where sensible caution must stop speculation. Walk any of Göbekli Tepe's exposed enclosures, and you confront a limited but powerful set of motifs. The most obvious are the animals: boars, foxes, gazelle, aurochs, wild cattle, leopards and large felids, snakes, cranes and other birds. Vultures figure often. Scorpions and arthropods, carved in low to high relief on the broad faces of the tall T-shaped pillars. Equally striking are non-figurative marks, repeated geometric patterns, zigzags, H-like characters, and parallel lines. Finally, the pillars themselves are stylized human forms, tall, narrow, T-headed stones with carved arms, belts, and sometimes loincloth-like motifs. These three elements, fauna, abstract marks, and anthropomorphized pillars, form the core lexicon of Göbekli Tepe's visual language. 2 points of method before interpretation. First, archaeologists treat these motifs as deliberate symbolic choices, not random decoration. The recurrence of the same species, poses, and signs across multiple enclosures implies shared meanings within a connected community. Second, and crucially, the site lacks written labels or direct ethnographic parallels that would let us translate icons into words. That means interpretations require comparison, iconographic patterns elsewhere, context, where a motif appears on a pillar or inside a ring, and restraint. Archaeologists present candidate readings with degrees of probability rather than definitive translations. Why so many animals? 2 basic facts ground scholarly discussion. First, the animal repertoire includes both hunted species, gazelle, boar, and animals with strong symbolic or ecological presence, vultures, snakes, large felids. Second, many animals are shown in dynamic or violent postures, wounded animals, animals with exposed ribs, or predators attacking. These formal choices suggest animals are not simply naturalistic portraits of subsistence species. They are signs embedded in social memory, mythic narratives, or ritual performance. Several interpretations have gained traction in peer-reviewed literature. Mnemonic or calendarical markers. Some scholars argue repeated animal groups could encode seasonal rounds, migration knowledge, or long-term environmental memory, a prehistoric mnemonic tied to time, hunting cycles, or celestial events. This idea is debated and requires careful supporting evidence, but it explains why certain animals recur in patterned combinations. Totemic or kin symbols. Recurrent animal figures may function like clan totems or identity markers. In societies without writing, durable art can serve as a public badge, an emblem that organizes who belongs and what responsibilities exist between groups. The use of distinctive animals across enclosures could indicate different group affiliations or ritual roles. Scapegoat or sacrificial narratives and cosmological roles.
The depiction of wounded or skinned animals and the prominence of predators and scavengers like vultures has been read as evidence for ritualized killing, mortuary practices, or cosmological symbolism connected to death and renewal. The presence of mass feasting debris at the site supports the idea that large ritual meals and associated animal processing were part of the site's life. All three readings can overlap. The same animal might serve as a seasonal marker at one level, a group emblem at another, and a figure in cosmological narrative at a third. The archaeological record supports layered meaning rather than single-purpose symbolism. The T-pillars are Göbekli Tepe's visual anchor. Seen at stylized human bodies, a wide head-shoulder slab above a narrow trunk, some pillars bear arms carved in low relief, belts, and even imprints interpreted as loincloths or necklaces. Yet the head is usually blank, no facial details. That selective humanization is telling. Klaus Schmidt and subsequent researchers proposed several interpretive possibilities. Grounded in context, the pillars could be surrogate humans, standing proxies for absent people, ancestors, mythical beings, or embodied deities presented in deliberately abstracted form. The carved belts or brocrania, bull skull motifs, on some pillars have led to suggestions that individual pillars may encode personal or group identity, perhaps memorializing important ancestors or heroes in a non-textual sculptural register. Two practical notes narrow possible readings. First, the pillars are often arranged in pairs facing one another, an architectural choice that suggests staged encounters, dialogues, performative exchanges, or ritual drama. The physical scale of the figures, often larger than life, amplifies their social presence. In a dark enclosure, the towering pillars would dominate sightlines and bodily orientation, turning architecture itself into narrative theater. These architectural cues favor ritual performance interpretations over mundane or decorative ones. Beyond animals and pillars, Göbekli Tepe's carved geometric signs, H-shapes, chevrons, and parallel lines appear across multiple stones and enclosures. Repetition matters archaeologically. Repeated formal devices indicate shared conventions, a grammar, rather than idiosyncratic art. Where signs cluster with specific animals or pillar types, scholars read those combinations as syntactic units. A particular animal plus sign may form a compound meaning, e.g., identity plus status or season plus ritual action. Because we lack a Rosetta Stone, these are probabilistic reconstructions, but the robust patterning, the same motifs repeatedly paired in different stones across centuries, demonstrates that people at Göbekli Tepe used a stable symbolic repertoire that communicated across time and social groups. That durability makes the site less like an ephemeral art project and more like a persistent record-keeping or memory system encoded in stone. A particularly persistent thread in interpretation centers on death and mortuary practice. Vultures, which appear frequently, are scavengers associated cross-culturally with exposure burials and the treatment of corpses. Modified human skulls found at some regional PPN, pre-pottery Neolithic, sites and evidence of skull cult practices nearby suggest that attitudes toward the dead played an important role in ritual life at the time. At Göbekli Tepe itself, the ritual use of animals and evidence for mass feasting provides a material backdrop for funerary ritual, ancestor commemoration, or social reconciliation through shared consumption. Several specialists caution, however, that funerary interpretation must not be assumed for every motif. Vultures and snakes can equally serve cosmological or symbolic roles unrelated to direct funerary practice. One of the most convincing ways to explain the iconography is to read it as the visual apparatus of large-scale social performance. The paired pillars, benched interiors, evidence of hearths, and mass butchery. Together, these features suggest episodic gatherings, inclusive events where people arrived from a wide territory to share food, renew alliances, perform rituals, and rehearse communal narratives.
The carved images, then, would be the stage props and signposts of those performances, visible anchors that structured rites, identified roles, and encoded shared stories. In that sense, the symbols are not static statements. They are active social tools that made cooperation legible and repeatable across generations. Göbekli Tepe did not exist in a vacuum. Excavations and geophysical surveys have revealed numerous contemporary sites in Upper Mesopotamia, for example, Karahan Tepe, and remnants like Navali Chori, now submerged, that use the same T-pillar format and share similar iconographies. The implication is a regional symbolic network, related groups sharing motifs and architectural conventions. Variation across sites, certain animal emphases, different decorative programs, suggests local identities within a broader communicative field. Symbolic systems therefore both unified and differentiated groups across the landscape.
It is equally instructive to note what the art does not provide. There are no inscriptions, no sequential narrative panels we can read like a story, and almost no clear depiction of agricultural practice, domestic scenes, or explicit kinship charts. That absence prevents us from drawing straight lines from motif to doctrine. Speculative claims, cosmic catastrophes encoded in Pillar 43, or Göbekli Tepe as an astronomic observatory with exact star charts, occasionally appear in popular discussions, but they either rest on tenuous correlations or selective readings. Scholarly consensus insists on parsimonious interpretations tied to stratigraphic context and faunal and botanical assemblages, and comparative iconography, not on sensational single-cause explanations. When specialists step back from lyrical readings, a pragmatic pattern emerges. Symbols at Göbekli Tepe operate as social technology. They do four interlocking jobs. Memory, durable images in stone preserve group knowledge across generations in a world without writing. Identity, recurring animals and signs mark affiliations and help outsiders recognize the structure of social relations. Performance scaffolding. Carved motifs organize ritual roles and sequence ceremonial actions during gatherings. Coordination. Visible, agreed-upon symbols reduce transaction costs when many groups assemble. People know what behavior is expected when they see the same icons and architectural layout. Read this way, the sculptures and reliefs are not static messages from the past alone. They are active instruments that made large-scale cooperation possible before towns, taxes, or written law codes. That argument, symbols as infrastructural tools of social complexity, lies at the heart of why Göbekli Tepe matters for understanding the origins of organized human life. The next decades of research will refine the grammar we sketched above. Ongoing work focuses on high-resolution mapping of motif distribution across the mound, microscopic analysis of tool marks to link carvers to particular workshops or traditions, stable isotope and residue studies that tie animal motifs to specific dietary or ritual resources, and wider regional surveys that establish whether specific animals correlate with particular valleys or seasonal hunting rounds. As those datasets grow, the interpretive confidence about whether a motif was primarily mnemonic, totemic, or cosmological, or some mix, will likewise increase. For now, the safest claim is that Göbekli Tepe's symbols formed a durable, shared visual language that coordinated beliefs and action across a connected set of communities during a pivotal chapter in human prehistory. Symbols at Göbekli Tepe are both intimate and public. They arise from the life experiences of small-scale communities, knowledge of animals, seasonal pressures, death, and feast, and they are scaled up into monumental forms that broadcast meaning across generations. The carvings are not a straightforward picture book of prehistoric life. They are a record of what mattered enough to be made permanent. Those choices, what to carve, what to omit, which animal to pair with which sign, are the most reliable traces we have of what these early people wanted future generations to remember. In stone, they aimed to fix a shared world, a ritual geography, a calendar of cycles, a map of social obligations. Today, when we stand before the silent reliefs, we are reading a social project as much as an art gallery. A project designed to make cooperation, memory, and meaning durable in a world that had just begun to settle down.
One of Göbekli Tepe's most startling features isn't the height of its pillars or the finesse of its carvings. It's what covers them. Where many ancient monuments lie exposed and slowly erode, Göbekli Tepe's monumental rings were found under meters of compacted soil, rubble, and collapsed architecture. For decades, archaeologists described this as an intentional burial. People had filled the enclosures with soil and debris, sealing their sacred architecture beneath deliberate backfill. In recent years, that neat story has been complicated by new fieldwork and geomorphological study. But the basic fact remains. By the time later people visited the mound, the great T-pillars lay entombed, preserved in a way that allowed modern excavators to read them as sealed episodes in a long human drama. What do we mean when we say burial? In practical terms, the large enclosures in the lower layers of the Göbekli Tepe mound were found filled with dense deposits, rubble, worked stone fragments, packed earth, and occasional cultural debris, sitting meters below the contemporary ground level. These fills preserved the carved faces of pillars and many sculptural fragments in a condition far better than if they had been left exposed to wind, rain, and erosional slope processes for millennia. Field reports from the original excavation seasons describe the fills as composed of intentionally placed blocks and soil, often with carved stone fragments deliberately broken and deposited amid the rubble. That pattern encouraged an interpretation. The builders or their descendants had chosen to backfill the enclosures, and that act of closure preserved them for us. But archaeology is not literary drama. New techniques and fresh fieldwork invite fresh readings. Over the past decade, geoarchaeological and geomorphological studies have shown the Göbekli Tepe mound to be an active landscape feature shaped by slope processes, quarrying, and episodic mass movements. Some enclosures, notably Enclosure D, show evidence of substantial slope collapse and inundation by sediments derived from higher on the ridge. In other words, at least part of what appears to be burial may result from natural redeposition, terraces collapsing, walls eroding, and loose material slumping downslope into the enclosures. This doesn't erase the traces of deliberate deposition, but it does mean the intentional backfill all at once story is too simple. The archaeological record preserves a palimpsest of human action and natural processes interacting over centuries. That insight leads to an important nuance. Scholars now typically treat the site's burial as the outcome of multiple processes, sometimes human, sometimes environmental, and often entangled. In some enclosures, archaeologists still see stratigraphic sequences that look like deliberate, careful deposition of carved fragments and worked stone in structured layers. In others, the fills have mixed sediments, collapsed architecture, and material that points to slope movement or later terrace collapse. The mix matters because it changes how we reconstruct social intentions. Did communities deliberately close a sacred place and ritually seal it? Or did they respond to landscape instability and practical constraints by abandoning and allowing nature to bury the architecture? The evidence supports both possibilities in different places and at overlapping times. Timing matters too. Radiocarbon and stratigraphic work indicate the monumental phases belong to the late 10th through the 9th millennium BCE, while burial and later fills are often placed in the later 9th or early 8th millennium BCE, the long tail of the pre-Pottery Neolithic sequence. That timing coincides with a period of social change across Upper Mesopotamia, increasing plant processing, more intensive use of landscape niches, and the slow emergence of more sedentary settlements in parts of the region.
Environmental events, including episodes of local erosion, changing rainfall patterns, and broader climatic fluctuations in the early Holocene, may have increased the frequency of slope and sediment movement. Thus, the apparent closure of some of Göbekli Tepe's great enclosures fits within a matrix of social transformation and environmental instability rather than pointing to a single cause. Why would people intentionally bury a sacred place? If we accept that deliberate backfilling took place in some contexts, archaeologists usually propose several non-exclusive motives, grounded in ethnographic analogy, archaeological parallels, and contextual evidence. Ritual termination or closing. Societies sometimes ritually decommission sacred places when their social role changes. Depositing carved fragments and filling interior spaces could mark an intentional ending, a consecrated closure that prevents further use but preserves the memory of the place. The deliberate placement of sculptural fragments amid fills at some enclosures is compatible with ritualized deposition. Practical reuse and stabilization. Large stone blocks and fill could be moved to stabilize terraces or to make the ridge more suitable for other kinds of activity. If buildings above the enclosures collapsed or were deliberately dismantled, quarry and clearance material would naturally be redeposited downslope, filling the rings. This process may blend pragmatic engineering with structured deposition. Social or political change. As social networks reconfigured, perhaps moving from periodic, long-distance congregations to more local settlement-focused life, the central ritual functions of Göbekli Tepe may have waned. Communities might have deliberately retired the site as their social calendars changed, burying monuments that no longer fit new practices. That explanation places human intention in a longer narrative of changing economies and identities. Response to environmental risk. If slope instability, sediment runoff, or waterlogging threatened structures, people might have filled vulnerable enclosures intentionally or semi-intentionally to protect carved faces or prevent dangerous collapses. Alternatively, they might have simply abandoned the site and allowed nature to take its course. Geomorphological evidence for slippage and mass movement makes this a credible component of the story. The debate is not purely academic. It shapes how we view social organization at the time. An intentional, ceremonial burial implies lasting ritual authority and symbolic decision-making. People chose to mark an end. Natural burial or abandonment points to different pressures: landscape change, resource reallocation, or demographic shifts. The reality at Göbekli Tepe likely includes both. Ritual agents acting within unstable landscapes and economic transformations, making the burial a compound historical act rather than a single moment of decision. There are also physical traces that support a mixed model. In some contexts, archaeologists have documented deliberately broken sculptural fragments carefully placed in fills, a pattern difficult to explain by simple slope collapse. In other places, the fills have a chaotic mix of terrace collapse debris and later domestic refuse, the sort of assemblage more consistent with erosion and later episodic human reoccupation. This patchwork points to a long, regionally variable process of site transformation rather than a single dramatic burial day. Recognizing the burial as a process rather than an event also reframes how we understand later uses of the mound. After monumental activity waned, people evidently returned, sometimes seasonally, sometimes more permanently, to use the site in new ways. Archaeological layers above the monumental fills show smaller stone buildings, domestic debris, and craft activity. That pattern indicates cultural memory. The place remained visible and meaningful even after its primary ritual architecture was entombed. The dead monument became a palimpsest, material evidence of past significance that continued to shape later human action. Finally, the sudden burial story is a reminder about the limits of archaeological interpretation. The stones do not come with labels explaining intention. What researchers can do, and do well at Göbekli Tepe, is combine stratigraphy, radiocarbon sequences, microstratigraphy, and sediment analysis, and regional geomorphology to create a plausible narrative that honors the evidence's complexity.
The early view of a single deliberate backfill was powerful and elegant. The current view is messier, but it is also truer to how humans operate in dynamic landscapes. Intent, accident, ritual, and nature braided together. The sudden burial may be less sudden than originally imagined, but it remains one of Göbekli Tepe's most evocative legacies. Whether deposited by purposeful hands or by the slow labor of slope and time, the fills preserve the symbolic project that helps us see a different path towards social complexity, one in which ritual architecture arises, terminates, and is transformed as people and environments co-evolve. In the next section, we'll follow the stone fragments into the hands of those who studied them, conservation, excavation ethics, and what it takes to preserve a 12,000-year-old mindscape for future inquiry.
When the last dust finally settled over Göbekli Tepe's buried rings, human communities did not stop changing. The centuries that follow are where the effects of the Taş Tepeler, the stone hills of southeastern Anatolia, are best read, not as a single cause that produced farming and cities overnight, but as a long, regionally varied sequence of social experiments that gradually produced the world of villages, fields, crafts, and monuments we now call the Neolithic. This section traces the well-evidenced sequence after Göbekli Tepe, the changing lifeways, the new places, and the slow technologies, sticking to dates and findings that have strong support in the specialist literature. Archaeologists divide the earliest Neolithic of the Near East into phases. Göbekli Tepe's main monumental work belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic A and the early pre-pottery Neolithic B horizons, roughly c. 9600 to 8200 BCE for the monumental phase, and into the 9th-8th millennia BCE for later activity and fills. After this period, across Upper Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant, we see increasingly durable villages, more systematic plant processing, fuller steps toward domestication, new architectural styles, and a growing density of sites across the landscape. In short, the centuries after Göbekli Tepe belong to a long, uneven march towards sedentary life and food production rather than to one abrupt revolution. Göbekli Tepe was never a solitary experiment. Once archaeologists began intensive surveys around Şanlıurfa, they identified a constellation of related sites, the Taş Tepeler, that share T-pillars, carved iconography, or similar planning. Karahan Tepe, for example, shows the same T-shaped stelae and animal reliefs and is now recognized as a contemporary partner in the region's ritual and symbolic life. Other nearby sites, such as Nevali Chori, excavated earlier but now mostly destroyed by dam flooding, provide early parallels for monumental architecture and local craft traditions. The geographic spread of these sites implies communication and shared symbolic vocabularies across groups, rather than an isolated, one-off event. One of the most important measurable changes after and during the Taş Tepeler sequence is in plant use. Sites in Syria and northern Mesopotamia, notably Tel Abu Hurera, provide some of the earliest evidence for people transitioning from gathering wild cereals to cultivating and later domesticating wheat and rye. Abu Hurera's archaeobotanical sequence shows intensive plant processing and early morphological signs of domestication beginning around 10,000 BP, roughly 8,000 to 9,000 BCE in calibrated terms depending on the sample, and continuing through the 9th millennium BCE. Rather than a single invention, domestication was a drawn-out process. People cultivated, selected, stored, and re-sowed plants over many generations, producing cereals that would later sustain denser populations and different social institutions. Following the PPNA-PPNB transition, we see the emergence of sites that look more like long-term villages. Chayoni in southeastern Anatolia and Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia are key examples. Chayoni shows long occupations with evidence for early cultivation and changing house forms. Çatalhöyük, occupied from roughly c. 7400 to 6200 BCE, becomes one of the best documented dense, long-lived Neolithic settlement with houses, murals, and complex ritual debris within domestic space. These villages were not states. They lacked writing, standing armies, or bureaucratic apparatus, but they do represent new social scales, larger, more permanent communities with more specialized craft production and more complex social networks than the small mobile bands of earlier millennia. It's tempting to draw a straight line from Göbekli Tepe's rituals to later village life, but the evidence supports a more measured view. The Taş Tepeler network shows that complex symbolic life and large communal projects already existed in the late 10th millennium BCE. This social capacity made some kinds of cooperative economic change, coordinated cultivation, storage, and craft specialization, more possible. In other words, ritual aggregation may have created social infrastructures, networks of reciprocity, shared calendars, prestige roles that later smoothed the adoption of cultivation and sedentary settlement in parts of the region. However, mainstream specialists cautioned that Göbekli Tepe did not cause agriculture single-handedly. Rather, it is best read as one node in a broader system of interacting social, ecological, and technological processes that together produced the Neolithic lifeways. A clear material change after the era of monumental enclosures is the proliferation of implements associated with plant processing. Grinding stones, mortars, storage pits, and hearth systems become far more common and abundant in many PPNB contexts. These tools reflect increased investment in plant foods, more work at home, larger stored reserves, and the logistics of supporting larger groups for longer seasonal windows. At the same time, lithic toolkits show increasing standardization and specialization, and craft traditions, stoneworking, bone tools, textile production traces become more elaborate, all signs of social life reorganizing towards sustained household economies allied with inter-household exchange. Göbekli Tepe prompted important debates about social hierarchy in early Neolithic contexts. The scale and specialization needed to construct monumental rings imply the existence of recognized leaders or coordinators who could mobilize labor, but that doesn't automatically mean rigid class systems. Specialists propose that many early Neolithic societies were status societies. Social prestige and authority accrued through ritual knowledge, hunting success, or control of symbolic resources, rather than through formalized hereditary economic inequality. Over centuries, however, some communities show evidence of increasing social differentiation, larger homes, differential burial goods, and specialized craft producers that foreshadows the more stratified societies of the later Neolithic and Chalcolithic. One of the central lessons from post-Göbekli Tepe archaeology is diversity. While Upper Mesopotamia and southeastern Anatolia followed a route toward village life and crop cultivation, other regions moved at different speeds and by different paths. The Levant, the Zagros, and parts of the Levantine corridor each showed distinct mixes of hunting, tending of wild plants, herding, and local innovations. The transition to a fully agricultural, sedentary economy was therefore neither synchronous nor uniform. It was a mosaic of local developments built on shared capacities for cooperation and symbolic coordination. Finally, the most durable legacy of the Taş Tepeler era may be conceptual rather than material. The idea that humans could invest in immovable symbols, big stones that anchored memory, identity, and ritual, reappears in later traditions across the Near East. Whether expressed in village shrines, domestic cult objects, or the grave markers of later times, the Neolithic preference for durable symbolic technologies, monuments, curated skulls, carved motifs, helped create the cultural infrastructure necessary for larger social projects. Those projects, cooperative agriculture, craft specialization, and eventually cities, depended on social trust and shared symbolism that institutions like Göbekli Tepe had helped to model centuries earlier. What came after Göbekli Tepe was not a single event, but centuries of experimentation. Communities in Upper Mesopotamia and adjacent zones moved gradually from wide-ranging foraging towards more settled life, experimenting with plant cultivation, developing new houses and tools, and increasing craft specialization. Göbekli Tepe and its regional partners show symbolic complexity and the ability to coordinate large projects predate and likely helped facilitate these economic changes. But domestication, villages, and later states emerged from many interacting lines of development, not from a single monumental seed. That careful, evidence-based framing is where the strongest academic consensus sits today.
There is a special kind of silence that falls over places where people once spoke loudly with stone. Göbekli Tepe's carved pillars do not whisper a continuous history. Instead, they mark a long pause, a span of millennia in which the meanings, names, and voices that produced those stones faded from living memory. This section follows that silence, how monuments fell quiet, how memory was lost or transformed, and how archaeology, patient, fragmentary, and objective, slowly listens back to a time that did not leave a written record. The first and simplest truth is structural. Stone endures far longer than the human institutions that explain it. The T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe were raised around the late 10th to early 8th millennium BCE, c. 9600 to 8200 BCE, a date range established by multiple radiocarbon sequences and stratigraphic studies. Those dates place the site roughly 11,000 to 12,000 years in the past, centuries before the urban, literate states of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Because the people who carved the pillars left no inscriptions or durable textual records at Göbekli Tepe, the cultural system that made the stones is not recorded in words. It survives only as architecture, reliefs, animal bones, and sediments. That mismatch, durable form without a surviving explanatory tradition, is the core of the silence archaeologists confront. Forgetting happens slowly, and for practical reasons. The material record shows a long, staggered transformation of the site, phases of construction and use, episodes of collapse and infill, later small-scale occupations among the ruins, and finally, centuries of weathering and agricultural disturbance. Some monumental enclosures were purposefully filled with rubble and soil. In other places, slope collapse and sedimentation played large roles. Together, these processes removed the living ritual contexts that made the places meaningful to their makers, converting a functioning ritual landscape into a mound of buried stone and silence. Modern geomorphological studies emphasize that the apparent sudden burial is often the product of overlapping human decisions and natural sedimentary processes across generations. That gradual compound burying is one reason cultural memory could not simply be reactivated by later inhabitants. The architecture itself was hidden beneath meters of deposit. Anthropologists and archaeologists who work with oral histories caution that traditional memory tends to preserve themes, names, and myths, rather than detailed technical descriptions of ritual choreography or architectural plans, and only if the social institutions that transmit that memory remain continuous. At Göbekli Tepe, the social world that sustained the monumental architecture appears to have fragmented or transformed. New patterns of settlement, shifting subsistence strategies, increasing plant processing and local cultivation, population movements, and changing ritual calendars all made earlier shared practices less relevant. When the social nodes that maintained the stories thin out, so too does fidelity of oral transmission. Without continuous custodians, priests, families, or communities bound to the same ritual calendar, the specific knowledge of why a pillar bore a fox or what a particular H sign meant could be lost within a few generations. Archaeology, therefore, encounters not an abrupt fall into silence, but a social drift away from particular memories. The material evidence also shows deliberate human gestures that contributed to silence. In some enclosures, archaeologists have documented carefully broken sculptural fragments placed into fills, a pattern compatible with ritual deposition or intentional closure. Elsewhere,
The fills look chaotic and include terrace collapse material consistent with erosion and quarrying. After the monumental phase waned, people reused the ridge for domestic or craft activities at different times. These later occupations may have respected the mound as a place of significance, yet lacked the institutional memory or ritual framework that produced the monuments. In effect, the site became a palimpsest, visible traces of prior importance that no longer carried the original script. That physical reworking both preserved and concealed the stones, creating the paradox that allowed modern archaeologists to find remarkably intact reliefs beneath the surface while still confronting centuries of cultural silence above them. The broader Near Eastern context explains part of the loss. The centuries after Göbekli Tepe's main use saw rapid experimentation across Upper Mesopotamia. New settlement forms, differential adoption of plant cultivation, shifting territorial patterns, and emergent local identities. As communities reorganized around household economies or local village life rather than seasonal, super-local gatherings, the social infrastructures, routes, patronage networks, shared ritual schedules that once knitted a wide region together loosened. When the gatherings that animated places like Göbekli Tepe became unnecessary or impractical, the social incentive to maintain the knowledge of their rituals dissipated. Over long time spans, what was once central can become peripheral, then obsolete, and finally a memory with no living holders. That sociological shift is basic to why many prehistoric monuments fall into silence. Social practice is fragile compared to carved stone. Archaeology does not reconstruct soundscapes, voices, or doctrines. It reconstructs behaviors from material traces. In Göbekli Tepe, this means reading architecture, iconography, faunal assemblages, toolkits, and microstratigraphic analysis to infer practice and meaning. Radiocarbon sequences tell us when monuments were active. Faunal and botanical remains show how people fed the gatherings. Carved iconography suggests shared symbolic repertoires. And site formation analysis explains how those things changed in time. None of these sources restores the original speech, but together they let scholars propose plausible narratives about the social life that once animated the stones. The work is painstaking precisely because the silence is real. Every interpretive claim must be closely tied to stratigraphy, context, and comparative data. The silence of time creates an ethical urgency. Once the social carriers of meaning are gone, the site itself becomes the only remaining archive. That archive is fragile. Erosion, plowing, illicit digging, and even unregulated tourism can irreversibly damage the stratigraphy that preserves the chronological and contextual clues archaeologists need. Göbekli Tepe's inscription as a UNESCO World Heritage Site recognizes its outstanding value and the need for careful conservation, but protection is never absolute. Effective stewardship requires ongoing conservation work, controlled excavation, and sensitive site presentation so that visitors can learn without dismantling the archaeological record. Preserving the mute archive is not merely about tourism or national pride. It is the only way to give future scholars more data to listen to the silence with greater fidelity. Silence is not merely an absence. It is itself data. The fact that Göbekli Tepe's builders left no writing, that later communities filled and abandoned the enclosures, and that the place was intermittently reused tells us about social priorities and pressures. Patterns of deposition indicate ritual termination in some contexts, and practical abandonment or landscape-driven burial in others. The disappearance of ritual specialists, the shift to household-centered economies, and the fragmentation of long-distance ritual circuits are social changes that the silence helps reveal. In short, what is not said, the discontinuities in practice and memory, can tell us as much about human transformation as the carved foxes or paired pillars. A sober point. Archaeology may never recover the names, liturgies, or mythic narratives that originally animated Göbekli Tepe. Oral traditions rarely preserve precise technical choreography or localized iconographic meanings across millennia. And absent a literate tradition tied to the place, the original translations of the motifs will probably remain speculative. This limitation is not failure. It is a reminder to practice humility in reconstruction. Strong claims require strong evidence, and many attractive narratives, astrology charts, cataclysmic events encoded in stone, or direct lines to later mythologies rest on speculative leaps beyond what the material supports. The discipline's credibility depends on distinguishing what the stones can
Legitimately tell us from what we wish them to tell. Standing at the edge of Göbekli Tepe, modern observers face a double silence, the mute stones and the long human absence that lies between then and now. That silence should not discourage curiosity, it should sharpen it. Silent stones demand rigorous listening, stratigraphy, laboratory science, comparative regional study, and careful theory all become instruments to recover plausible stories. The absence of a name does not negate significance. Instead, it enlarges the question. What forms of cooperation, ritual imagination, and memory-making could produce such durable things in a pre-literate world? The silence, paradoxically, is the stage on which new knowledge is constructed. Time is an eraser and a preserver. It can bury what people wanted to remember, and yet the very choice to build in stone preserved enough that we can, 10,000 years later, reconstruct the outlines of an extraordinary chapter in human life. The silence of time is resigned and generous at once. It denies us direct speech, but it leaves durable traces that reward patient, disciplined reading.
Göbekli Tepe's stones waited silently for most of human history. Then, within a single generation of careful archaeology, they forced scholars to rewrite the timeline of social complexity. The modern awakening at Göbekli Tepe is not a single moment, but a cascade. A critical discovery in the 1990s, 2 decades of excavation and debate, new teams and technologies after 2014, and an expanding regional horizon of related sites that together have turned a quiet ridge in southeastern Anatolia into the center of one of the most important archaeological stories of our time. Although the hill was known to surveyors since the 1960s, the site's true significance came into focus when German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began focused fieldwork in 1995. Over nearly 2 decades, Schmidt's team revealed the dramatic T-shaped pillars and circular enclosures that upended accepted models of when people first built monumental architecture. His record of fieldwork, careful stratigraphy, and insistence on obtaining radiocarbon dates established Göbekli Tepe as a secure prehistoric complex that predates the earliest known monumental architecture in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Schmidt's death in 2014 was a loss to the project, but his published campaigns laid the chronological and methodological bedrock that subsequent teams would build on. The robustness of Göbekli Tepe's impact depends on chronology. Multiple radiocarbon samples, taken from contexts tied to construction and use, placed the main monumental phases broadly in the late 10th to early 8th millennia BCE,
commonly expressed in the literature as roughly 9600–8200 BCE for the earliest massive enclosures. Those dates are what make the site exceptional. Monumental architecture, carved iconography, and complex communal investment appear here millennia before the first written records and the emergence of urban states. While specific sample calibrations and phase definitions have been refined over time, the overall radiocarbon picture remains the anchor for the site's extraordinary significance. After Schmidt's death, the excavation mantle passed to a cooperative framework involving the German Archaeological Institute, the Şanlıurfa Museum, and later Istanbul University, under project directors such as Professor Necmi Karul and field coordinators like Dr. Lee Clare. That institutional continuity matters. It bundled international expertise, ensured conservation investments, notably the protective shelters completed in 2017, and allowed the project to scale beyond single-season sensationalism into a disciplined, long-term research program. The UNESCO World Heritage inscription in 2018 further formalized the site's global significance and accelerated conservation planning and public outreach. The awakening is as much methodological as it is descriptive. Early surprise met excavation reality. The site preserved sealed contexts, carved fragments, and abundant eco-facts, all amenable to modern laboratory techniques. Over the last decade and more, archaeologists have layered geophysical prospection, high-resolution radiocarbon series, microstratigraphic sediment analysis, archaeobotany, and zooarchaeology to move from evocative speculation toward tightly argued models. Geophysical surveys revealed that the mound hides many more enclosures than those opened by trenches, a constellation of features across the ridge and its surroundings that point to sustained and patterned activity across centuries. Those non-invasive surveys allowed researchers to map the scale of the complex without unnecessarily disturbing fragile contexts. Initial interpretations, spearheaded by Schmidt, favored a model in which Göbekli Tepe functioned primarily as a ritual sanctuary, a place of supra-local gatherings for hunting groups who returned seasonally to build, feast, and perform rites. That model remains influential because the scale and iconography strongly support organized ritual practice. But more recent analyses have complicated this neat dichotomy. Continued excavation and specialist studies have documented domestic features, plant processing tools, and water harvesting installations, cisterns and channels that point to at least episodic habitation and food production activity on or near the ridge. In short, the site's life history appears mixed, monumental ritual architecture alongside domestic and subsistence-related behaviors, and the boundary between sanctuary and settlement is porous. That complexity reframes Göbekli Tepe as a long-term social hub with multiple overlapping functions rather than as a single-purpose temple or an exclusively domestic village. The Göbekli Tepe story widened dramatically as archaeologists recognized sibling sites across the Orfa Plain and surrounding Tek Mountains, a cluster now often referred to as the Taş Tepeler. Karahan Tepe, discovered earlier but intensively investigated in recent years, reveals T-pillars and reliefs with iconographies closely related to Göbekli Tepe's repertoire. The spread of similar monumental formats across multiple sites demonstrates that the social and symbolic experiments visible at Göbekli Tepe were not an isolated eccentricity. They were part of a regional phenomenon, a shared cultural field in which groups exchanged practices, craftsmen, and ritual repertoires. This regionalization has opened a new comparative archaeology. Rather than explaining Göbekli Tepe in isolation, researchers now read it as one node in a network of interconnected prehistoric monuments. Recent geoarchaeological work has also nuanced earlier claims about the site's sudden burial. Sedimentology and slope stability analyses show that natural processes, terrace collapse, runoff, and episodic mass movement interacted with human decisions, intentional infilling, and reuse of worked stone to produce the complex fills that preserved the pillars. That doesn't overturn the observation that some deposits show deliberate placement of sculptural fragments. It does mean archaeologists now read the burial as a palimpsest of activities across time, not a single dramatic act. This shift toward process-based site formation understanding is the hallmark of the modern scientific approach to Göbekli Tepe. Part of the modern awakening has been the transition from specialist discovery to public heritage. Infrastructure investments, protective shelters, visitor centers, and museum exhibitions in Urfa have made the site more accessible while aiming to protect fragile deposits. UNESCO listing brought both prestige and responsibility. Conservation plans, visitor management, and national stewardship became priorities. That attention helps protect the stratigraphy and fund continued research, but it also requires balancing tourism, local stakeholder interests, and scientific integrity. The modern awakening thus has an ethical and managerial dimension. Archaeological knowledge must be produced responsibly and preserved for future refinement. Perhaps the most characteristic feature of the modern awakening is how it changed the questions scholars ask. Göbekli Tepe used to be framed as a single radical anomaly that proved ritual preceded agriculture. Contemporary scholarship asks more nuanced questions. How did ritual aggregation, demographic thresholds, and local ecologies interact to produce shared monumentality? How mobile were the labor pools, and what technologies enabled stone shaping without metallurgy? What role did feasting and food storage play in building social obligations? And crucially, how typical was Göbekli Tepe within the region's broader social landscape? Answering these questions demands interdisciplinary teams: archaeobotanists, sedimentologists, zoo archaeologists, geophysicists, and long-term commitment to careful excavation, sampling, and conservation. What the modern awakening delivers, grounded in radiocarbon sequences, comparative regional surveys, and new analytical techniques, is not a single neat replacement for the old textbook timeline. Instead, it gives us a more complex and humane picture. People in the 10th millennium BCE were experimenting with social forms and material technologies in ways that could scale up cooperation long before states and writing emerged. Göbekli Tepe remains an archaeological text written in stone, but the modern awakening provides the tools to read that text with increasing precision. Each new season of work refines dates, maps regional connections, and tightens the arguments. The site's true gift is methodological as well as intellectual. It forced archaeology to update its methods, its models, and its humility about how and when complexity arose.
Göbekli Tepe and its neighbors force a simple, important correction to the story we tell about ourselves. Large-scale ritual architecture, coordinated labor, and complex symbolic life existed long before cities, writing, or dynastic states. The monumental rings on that Anatolian ridge date to the late 10th through the early 8th millennium BCE, commonly rendered c. 9600, 8200 BCE. They are not anachronistic novelties, but reliable, well-dated evidence that people in the early Holocene were already experimenting with ways of organizing social life at scale. That conclusion refrains cause and effect at the dawn of the Neolithic. For decades, textbooks presented a tidy sequence: agriculture, surplus, specialists, monuments, states. Göbekli Tepe complicates that chain. The archaeological record supports a different, more nuanced model in which ritual aggregation, shared symbolic systems, and episodic cooperation were themselves important engines of social integration, capacities that could make sustained investments in plant processing, settlement, and craft specialization more feasible over generations. In short, communal belief and coordinated labor look like drivers of social complexity as much as consequences. Equally important is restraint. The stones do not say everything. Göbekli Tepe is not a civilization in the sense archaeologists reserve for urban bureaucratic polities with writing and institutionalized inequality. Its builders left no inscriptions and no clear administrative apparatus. What survives are architecture, carved imagery, animal bones, tools, and stratified deposits, durable and revealing traces, but not a full ethnography. The best scholarship therefore combines confident statements about chronology and material practice with careful uncertainty about motive, myth, and mental worlds. The site's later life, its partial burial, reuse, and eventual forgetting also matters as history. It shows how social forms change. Ritual centers may be decommissioned, communal calendars may fragment, and memory may fade when the social institutions that sustain it dissolve. Yet the very choice to carve stone preserved enough that 12,000 years later we can reconstruct crucial contours of a pivotal social experiment. That paradox, loss enabling later recovery, makes Göbekli Tepe both poignant and generative for historians and archaeologists. Finally, the broader lesson is methodological and conceptual. Göbekli Tepe pushed archaeology to refine methods, high-resolution dating, landscape survey, geoarchaeology, and to ask bolder, better-framed questions about the origins of complexity. It teaches humility. Deep human prehistory is not a straight ladder, but a braided set of local experiments, failures, adaptations, and continuities. Those experiments produced the social technologies, symbolic repertoires, ritual calendars, obligation networks that eventually made villages, cereals, and cities possible. So when we speak of beginnings, let us do so with nuance. The echo before civilization is not a single origin story, but an early, resonant chapter in a long human conversation about cooperation, meaning, and memory. Göbekli Tepe offers us a clear message. The roots of organized human life are older, richer, and more socially inventive than one supposed, and the work of listening to that past is only beginning.